Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, the EPA released its blueprint to muzzle EPA Ombudsman Robert Martin, threatening to derail all of his cases, including Alberton. Meanwhile, the EPA finally retested the Alberton spill site. We now conclude Part 5, Derailed, with Chapters 4 and 5. Chapter 4, Truth, Justice, and Democracy. Epigraph. Even if they appointed Jesus Christ to be the ombudsman, he couldn't be an ombudsman because of the rules. Hugh Kaufman. On April 22, 2002, Robert Martin resigned as National EPA Ombudsman, subject to a prospective ruling from the U.S. Office of Special Counsel or the federal courts, he wrote Christine Whitman. Whitman had refused to meet with Martin and had the Office of Inspector General raid his office and seize his files while he was out. Martin: I cannot recognize in principle and conscience, however, the seizure of my files and planned transfer to the Office of Inspector General, where I will not continue to serve as an independent ombudsman, but will merely answer a telephone. Beyond the diligent achievement of cooperative solutions to environmental crises facing American communities, I also maintain that the Ombudsman must stand for truth, justice, and democracy. I hope you find it in yourself to recognize that by obliterating the independent Ombudsman function, you have deprived the American people and the Congress of a valuable means with which to keep the EPA true to its mission of protecting human health and the environment, and to be accountable to American communities. Martin continued in his letter to Whitman, the American people deserve nothing less than a truly independent ombudsman, especially those facing threats to their health by uncontrolled hazardous and toxic waste sites across the nation, most recently at Ground Zero in New York City. I enter private life today as a citizen enriched by my working relationship with American communities and with a steadfast assurance that this remains a government of, by, and for the people. As my role as National Ombudsman ends, I will continue to work in truth with any and all for the protection of the health, safety, and environment of American citizens. Thus was Martin's noble goodbye. Martin made clear to media that he would never give up his independence and simply answer a hotline for $118,000 a year. In 9 years here, he said, I've never heard anyone at the agency say, we screwed up. But the record shows that they do. Without judicial review of Superfund decisions, the American people live in a chasm between the EPA's belief that it can do no wrong and those bad decisions. The Ombudsman's office occupied that chasm. Now, that office is no more, Martin said. Happy Earth Day, Christy, Hugh Kaufman relayed through Idaho media. This is the end of all ombudsman cases. Some of us may continue to work on those cases, but they won't be ombudsman cases. They will be EPA speaking with one voice cases, Kaufman chided. Community activists nationwide bemoan the loss of their only voice. The moves by EPA administrations seemed a bureaucratic coup against democracy, an abuse of power. Martin's watch had ended. Late April, the EPA named an EPA Regional Inspector General, Mary Peggy Boyer, as interim ombudsman. Speaking for Boyer, EPA's Inspector General Nikki Tinsley said they would review and complete the existing ombudsman caseload. At a June 25 Senate committee hearing, the support for Martin ran overwhelmingly in favor of the ombudsman legislation. The EPA's IG office stood alone in recommending the ombudsman stay at IG. Republican and Democratic lawmakers, community activists, and company owners from across the nation called for an independent ombudsman. Martin testified at length, including about the transfer of the office and the effect on contaminated communities. Since May, Martin had agreed to a request by the U.S. Office of Special Counsel to mediate his case with the EPA, saying he wanted to return for 1 year and finish open cases. He continues to await a reply from the EPA, Martin said of himself. Martin ended his testimony by stating his vision for the EPA Ombudsman Office. An ombudsman should be entirely independent of the agency that it investigates. I agree with the testimony of the United States Ombudsman Association, therefore, that the national ombudsman function established by the Congress should be located within Congress and report directly to the Congress, with the ability to make collateral recommendations to the executive branch through the EPA and the White House Council on Environmental Quality. As I enunciated in my resignation nearly 2 months ago, the American people deserve nothing less than a truly independent and empowered national ombudsman to protect their health and environment. I entrust the Congress with the noble task of establishing this ombudsman institution for the people of the United States of America. In a new revelation, Martin reported to media that the FBI was investigating Whitman about her financial connections to over a dozen Superfund sites formerly under his investigation, including the Alberton spill. Whitman had a large financial interest in Raytheon, a subsidiary of Washington Group International, also the main contractor chosen by the EPA for the Coeur d'Alene Basin cleanup. In connecting the dots, Martin told Idaho Press, I believe she has financial connections to half the sites we were investigating. That July, Hugh Kaufman received a boost. The U.S. Labor Department ruled on his latest whistleblower complaint, ordering the EPA to reinstate him to the Ombudsman Office. The media reported Kaufman had suffered a continuing pattern of discrimination for the last several years, and the EPA established no evidence of a valid reason for his removal from ombudsman support duties. The complainant had been prohibited from performing those duties in reprisal for performing a too effective job in support of the ombudsman program. Within a week, the EPA filed an appeal, and Kaufman vowed to depose Whitman not only about Citigroup ties to Superfund sites, but her decision to transfer the Ombudsman office. EPA's Office of Inspector General released a report on their investigation into Martin's allegations of Whitman's conflict of interest and that she had participated in either remedy selection decisions or settlement negotiation decisions that affected the liability of Citigroup at the Shattuck and Marshall Superfund sites, and had made misleading statements about results of air monitoring tests conducted at the World Trade Center site to the benefit of travelers' insurance. OIG found that Whitman had no participation whatsoever in the Shattuck and Marshall sites, and that her statements about the WTC site were based on information given by Region 2 EPA. OIG wrote, the allegations were not substantiated. Criminal prosecution was declined. No further investigation is warranted. Kaufman scoffed to the media about the EPA OIG. They're under the direct control of Whitman, he said. That's like John Mitchell clearing Richard Nixon in Watergate. Kaufman said of the OIG's Whitman report, it was a cover-up. Considering the cross-allegations between Martin and the EPA and OIG, the propriety of having the EPA Inspector General conduct the Whitman investigation was highly questionable. Notably, in exonerating Whitman of any wrong actions concerning a conflict of interest, the OIG did not investigate Whitman's motives for transferring the Ombudsman office, which appeared to be a retaliation and at odds against the call for a more independent ombudsman. Furthermore, her transfer of Martin potentially affected the Shattuck decision and Citigroup's cost, whose new remedy Martin was to have overseen, as well as other case sites. And if the new ombudsman were to reverse any of Martin's recommendations or significantly alter the course of investigations, Whitman's action on the Ombudsman office certainly would have the effect of taking an action on sites under investigation. In July 2002, Lucinda Hodges wrote interim ombudsman Boyer to tell her she'd heard nothing about the Alberton case since Martin's January 2001 memo announcing the case was on hold, except the EPA had conducted their recent testing. Frustrated, she recounted the situation, concluding, all that we know to do is simply request that as soon as the Alberton site file is reviewed, that your office contact us with an update on how, when, or if the investigation will proceed and exactly what remedy, if any, will be offered after nearly 7 years of living the lives of the damned. Hodges traveled to Kellogg during Boyer's Idaho visit to meet her and assess where the Alberton case stood. She was only told the case was open and ongoing. As for assessing Boyer, Hodges felt she politely slams Bob Martin as often as possible. In August 2002, freelance journalist David Bond revealed that an executive order signed by President Bush on May 6 gave the EPA administrator the same power to classify information as secret as applied to the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the CIA. Hugh Kaufman didn't understand the national security shield. He told Bond, as one of the people who started with the EPA and who helped write all of the hazard waste and solid waste cleanup laws and regulations in the last 30 years, I can say with absolute authority that I have never seen, nor would I believe, that any documents related to cleaning up and preventing environmental harm can compromise the security of the United States. We are the country's janitors, he said. Boyer told Hodges she would have to file a FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act request, to try and get supporting information on the Alberton case. As soon as we complete our preliminary review, I will inform you of our conclusions, Boyer said. In late September, after 9 months of fading hopes, Senate Bill 606 finally passed unanimously by the Senate Environmental and Public Works Committee. Under the proposed bill, the Ombudsman would become a presidential appointee confirmed by the Senate with a 5-year term and would hire and fire staff and set his or her own budget. It also required the Ombudsman to appoint full-time regional deputies, provide whistleblower protections for people giving information to the Ombudsman, and give the Ombudsman powers to issue subpoenas and hold public hearings. The bill was everything Ombudsman supporters had hoped for. In November, the GAO released a follow-up report concluding that the EPA Ombudsman still lacked independence consistent with professional standards, noting lack of control over budget and in choosing investigations. The GAO urged the EPA to rethink the move to OIG. That month, the full Senate unanimously passed SB 606, despite strong objections from the Bush administration. Because the bill had yet to pass the House Energy and Commerce Committee, it would need reintroduction in 2003. In 2003, another Ombudsman bill received unanimous approval in the Senate. But under threat of a Bush veto, Representative Bilirakis restyled the 2003 House version of his Ombudsman Reauthorization Act, keeping the office in the EPA's OIG. A Florida activist commented, "The bill looks like EPA wrote it." If so, George W. Bush and Christine Whitman ghost-wrote the last chapter of legislative efforts to resurrect a better and independent EPA ombudsman. The bill died in the 2003 Congress. Momentum passed, an era ended. If the American people deserved nothing less than a truly independent ombudsman, as Martin had written, then corporate polluters and the politicians they polluted had torpedoed Independence Day. The hourglass now drained on both the Superfund tax and the independent-spirited EPA ombudsman position as molded and embodied by Robert Martin. Truth, justice, and democracy derailed. Chapter 5. Case closed. Epigraph. When a corporation is irresponsible in handling toxic materials, the victims of these irresponsible acts are left holding the bag. The injured victims either suffer the consequences of living in contaminated housing or abandon those homes and everything they have worked for and invested in. Lucinda Hodges. Senators Max Baucus and Conrad Burns asked the EPA to respond to specific allegations made afresh by Roger Chalmers in November 2002, and the EPA passed the request on to OIG as part of the investigation Robert Martin left behind. Auditor Edward Baldinger and civil engineer John Cole of the OIG Office of Audit met with Lucinda Hodges in July of 2003. The OIG had a narrow focus, seeking documents and references for any claims regarding the EPA. Baldinger didn't see anything substantial to complaints about the EPA's role in Alberton. He thought the, quote, biggest screw-up was the handling of chlorine information by doctors and the treatment of patients. They had the information and didn't use it, he thought. He was surprised no one had sued doctors or hospitals. The health of the people, he said, that was the story. But that had always been the story. In April 2004, the OIG closed the Alberton case with letters to Montana's senators. They wrote, the OIG team's preliminary research objective was to evaluate and determine if Mr. Chalmers' allegations were valid. It was unclear why Chalmers' renewed allegations determined the focus of the investigation when many others had been involved in petitioning the former ombudsman. But as such, Chalmers' allegations largely framed and limited the OIG investigation. OIG wrote, we have completed this review using our own independent team of reviewers and have concluded that the allegations presented by Mr. Chalmers were not supported by the facts. Therefore, no further action is planned on our part. OIG enclosed an appendix that summarized issues brought forth by Chalmers and also by Lucinda Hodges, along with EPA responses and the OIG evaluation. During interviews, Chalmers and Hodges together raised 5 main issues that OIG identified and addressed as the heart of their investigation. Complaint number 1, a fire at the site that caused a mixed chemical reaction. OIG wrote, while a small fire from a welding torch did occur, the fire was not intense, nor was it in contact with any of the hazardous waste at the site. Based on our interviews with individuals familiar with the events at the Alberton site, including the fire chief for the Frenchtown Rural Fire District, Scott Waldron, and an EPA toxicologist, Chris Weiss, Mr. Chalmers and Ms. Hodges' issues were not supported. In fact, the documented welding fire occurred on April 15. Hodges always claimed the fire occurred early on April 11 when the chemicals were being released. OIG wrote, the EPA's on-scene coordinator, Steve Way, stated that there was no high-temperature fire that would create a dioxin environment, besides the smoking grass fire away from the spill area that was sparked by a torch. Furthermore, if there were a chemical mixture, the heat from the chlorine tank rupture would destroy any trace of the mixture. Way doubts that a chemical mixture ever occurred. Sampling data showed that the chlorinated phenol concentrations decreased rapidly to non-detectable levels a short distance from the spill area, OIG concluded. These confusing statements contradicted each other. OIG's conclusion reflected little investigation and understanding. A chemical mixture did occur, forming chlorinated compounds. Hodges and others believed the fire on April 11 may have helped in the migration of chlorinated compounds created during the exothermic reaction between chlorine and potassium cresylate. No one claimed the chemical mixture only occurred because of an alleged fire. OIG apparently confused chemical mixture and dioxin formation, and dioxins were later found. Finally, their statement of destructive heat from the chlorine was indecipherable. OIG botched the investigation of an allegation in chemistry they did not understand. Additionally, any fire was peripheral to a core belief and complaint of many spill victims that they had been exposed to more than chlorine. Complaint number 2, a railroad car was buried at the site. OIG said a Region 8 Criminal Investigation Division report in 1998 responded to Chalmers' allegation from Russell Simmons' videotape that purportedly depicted the burial of 3 rail cars. EPA told OIG that CID had an expert technical team review the tape and determined that there was no indication that waste chemicals were buried at the site. OIG concluded, we did not see in the videotape any evidence of railroad cars being buried. The record showed that all the damaged railroad cars had been returned to rail service, repaired, or destroyed by Rocky Rail Service. This complaint had been solely Chalmers and was mainly irrelevant to residents' health issues. Complaint number 3, the railroad did not allow EPA on the site. OIG wrote, Mr. Chalmers' assertion was accurate to a degree. The EPA was allowed into the exclusion zone but denied access to the hot zone until 3 days after the incident began. The on-scene coordinator advised that this type of restriction is typical at sites during the initial days of a large incident. In fact, original OSC Tien Nguyen said he had never before been denied such access. The EPA told OIG that initially Montana Rail Link was reluctant to allow EPA on the accident site. Also, the state wanted EPA to tread lightly because at the time of the incident, federal agents were in the area looking for the Unabomber. In fact, the Unabomber was arrested the week prior to the spill. OIG. A replacement on-scene coordinator, Steve Way, also acknowledged that initially EPA was not well received. Local authorities misunderstood EPA's role, for example, regulatory versus response activities. The second OSC stated he was able to clear the air with the incident commander, Montana Rail Link, and the state of Montana's Department of Emergency Management Services. OIG concluded EPA was allowed into the exclusion zone but denied access to the hot zone until 3 days after the incident began, a common practice. Another OSC added that restrictions are typical at a site during the initial day or two at large incidents, while the incident command evaluates who needs to be involved and what EPA's role is to be. In fact, the EPA had the jurisdictional authority to be involved, and it was not up to the state, and certainly not the polluter, to determine EPA's role. The original on-scene coordinator, Wynn, said it was highly unusual for the EPA to be denied access as it was in the Alberton spill, not common practice or typical. Even Auditor Ed Beldinger said it was, quote, atypical for an OSC to defer to local officials. He described on-scene coordinators as cowboys. They take charge. Bollinger presumably did not write the report that IG Nikki Tinsley signed. OIG also failed to note that the EPA wasn't even allowed to view the site from I-90 until April 13. OIG ignored the serious tension between Wynn, Waldron, and MRL in Wynn's frustrating attempts to gain access. Most importantly, they did not investigate why the EPA was kept out in the Alberton spill, including looking into any agreement between Governor Mark Roscoe and MRL owner Dennis Washington to shut out the EPA, as alleged by Jim Green of the Montana Department of Emergency Services and Tim Murphy of the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation. Complaint number 4. The EPA did not ensure the health and safety of the residents. This was the key issue for spill victims, though the complaint had not been limited to EPA oversight. Health issues drove the petition to Ombudsman Martin and lay at the heart of years of seeking help and answers by Hodges and many others. Oddly, OIG narrowly construed what public health and safety meant. They wrote, the EPA did not have responsibility for initiating public health measures at the site. According to regulations, this responsibility rests with the local authorities, as they are normally the first on site and are expected to take proper precautions in accordance with state and local procedures. OIG cited a section of the National Contingency Plan. They wrote, specifically, this section states that because state and local public safety authorities would normally be the first governmental representatives at the scene of a discharge or release, they are expected to initiate public safety measures that are necessary to protect public health and welfare, and are responsible for directing evacuations pursuant to existing state or local procedures. In their more detailed appendix, OIG listed this complaint as health and safety of residents. The EPA should have taken care of the residents' emergency needs. OIG wrote that the EPA said that local officials, including the incident commander and local public health officials, for example, the Missoula City-County Health Department, were responsible for the health and safety of the populace, and EPA had responsibility for the overall safety of workers on the site. While the OIG narrowly and briefly addressed the broad topic of public health and safety related to the entire response and aftermath by speaking mainly to the initial response, this was, after all, a Superfund site, and the EPA's main responsibility was public health and safety once they were on scene and given access. In fact, Weiss defined his EPA role as assessing the hazards of the spill and the risks involved to safeguard public health, both at the site and in the surrounding community. Hodges and Chalmers' complaint referred to the ongoing conditions beyond the first day and even beyond general reentry. OIG's investigation failed to address this, which was fundamentally Alberton spill victims' main complaint, that they faced ongoing contamination and experienced chronic illness from it. But in their appendix, OIG included an addendum to the EPA response to the investigation. They wrote, Alberton residents were advised about the health effects of chlorine. They were also told that they could become hypersensitive to very low dosages of chlorine in household bleach or swimming pools. This is not uncommon in exposures to chemicals. Here, OIG's report elaborated a little beyond the initial day of the spill, with the EPA vaguely saying that residents were advised about the effects of chlorine and told something about potential hypersensitivity to chlorine. OIG did not evaluate this EPA addendum. The advice on hypersensitivity to, quote, very low dosages of chlorine in fact reflected warnings belatedly given a few days into the spill only after residents had complained about reactions after using hotel pools. This and the EPA's main answer emphasizing the initial response and the OIG wording of the complaint that also emphasized residents' emergency needs revealed that OIG never investigated or answered the most pressing health complaint repeatedly given to the EPA over many years, which was, residents suffered illness upon visiting and returning, followed by chronic illness, especially in reaction to something in the local environment. To spill victims like Hodges, the omission was beyond belief. The EPA response, nothing but a blatant dodge. Hypersensitivity lay at the heart of the complaints arising from the spill. More so, people exhibited multiple chemical sensitivity, not just hypersensitivity to bleach or chlorinated water. These symptoms were especially aggravated upon return to Alberton. Furthermore, people exhibited chronic sensitivity, not temporary, as the EPA had suggested during the time of the spill. The EPA and health officials had greatly downplayed the issue of sensitivity during the brief time they addressed it to evacuees, while ATSDR later simply ignored it. Also, the scant hypersensitivity reference OIG cited did not begin to relate the degree of symptoms suffered by many victims. This narrow look on health issues by the OIG was the official culmination of all the health-related complaints by residents to the EPA over 8 years. Again, OIG did not understand what they were investigating. And finally, complaint number 5. The EPA misrepresented information in a report. OIG said that Region 8 responded to Chalmers' allegations that the draft START report had many errors. They wrote, the investigation results did not support his claims, except that the report originally mischaracterized the hazardous zinc sulfate car as containing non-hazardous waste, a car that didn't spill. Chalmers' main concerns had been that other cars had spilled, including car 17, his mystery car, which he never accepted as being empty. And so, 2 out of the 5 main complaints identified by OIG were primarily Chalmers' questionable allegations. The OIG report dismissed any remaining allegations concerning past or ongoing EPA involvement, at least as OIG had identified. As a result of our review, we have closed our file, Inspector General Tinsley concluded for the Montana Senators. Auditor Baldinger of EPA Region 5 was tasked by OIG to finish the Alberton case. Baldinger passed the buck on complaints against the EPA. He said, I see the problem as a health and safety issue with the local emergency planning agencies and the health department. I believe if you delve into that issue, Alberton, Missoula, and many small communities throughout the USA are ill-equipped and unprepared to handle a catastrophe similar to the chlorine spill or a terrorist threat. Baldinger saw the health issue nearly as one of the initial acute exposure, the response to which had had nothing to do with the EPA. This completely missed the point of the Alberton complaints. Alberton victims would never know how far former EPA Ombudsman Robert Martin would have taken his investigation. Ultimately, his involvement was disappointing, in part because the initial hope had been so promising. In the year leading up to his office's forced move to OIG, Martin was overworked, understaffed, and short on resources, while having to fight the EPA over the integrity of his position. Not much progressed on the Alberton case after the November 2000 hearing, besides the limited 2001 environmental testing. But without Martin, there would have been no scoping hearing, and without his essentially forced resignation, there would likely have been at least one more hearing. If nothing else, the sole hearing allowed victims to have a public, on-the-record voice in airing their complaints, which had gone almost entirely ignored previously. Martin had hoped the 2001 testing would show results, and he likely had expectations of significant contamination at the site and possibly elsewhere, because that had been the pattern at other sites. If Martin had stayed on, he would have had to accept the results unless he felt the tests inadequate. Testing 5.5 years after the spill likely foreordained scant results, considering the chemicals involved in the original cleanup. In the absence of actionable remaining contamination, it was questionable what else Martin could have accomplished to practically address health complaints of victims. He wasn't the ombudsman for ATSDR. What Martin likely would have attempted was a closer examination of how the EPA and other agencies responded to victims' health complaints, especially upon return to Alberton. Meanwhile, the EPA closed the case on ombudsman. Having neutered the EPA National Ombudsman, the OIG released a memorandum in 2003 concerning the EPA Regional Ombudsman Program. The OIG stated that because the regional ombudsman function was generally a collateral duty within the Superfund program, there was a perceived lack of independence and impartiality for the ombudsman, they wrote. But OIG claimed the regional ombudsmen were not intended to be advocates for a community, person, or institution. Rather, the role is to listen to all sides in an impartial, objective manner, and to provide assistance in trying to understand and resolve the problem. OIG noted the EPA had addressed the GAO's concerns about the independence and impartiality of the regional Superfund ombudsman. OIG's recommendations were twofold. First, to change the job title to better reflect their role within the organization, they said. Without saying it, OIG was getting rid of ombudsman, so people wouldn't have expectations of one. Second, they recommended developing clear, consistent national guidance describing the roles and responsibilities of the position. OIG's answer was to continue the function of informally resolving issues at a local level, but changing the job title, which would alleviate the perception that the regional ombudsman should meet the American Bar Association's core characteristics of impartiality and independence. In sum, more EPA control to ensure accountability to the EPA. One voice. The EPA Regional Ombudsman title was changed to Regional Public Liaison Manager, serving as a facilitator to help resolve concerns and provide information. The EPA alleviated the perception that they even had ombudsmen. Official investigations into Alberton were done. The book closed for good. ATSDR, EPA, even Bob Martin. For Hodges, it had all ended with a series of dead-end whimpers. Her remaining hope for justice lay in court. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. We begin the final part of the book, Part 6, The Last Train, which examines the only remaining avenue for justice for the Alberton spill victims, litigation. Until then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.